In the last tutorial, I created my game objects, such as my ball and my two paddles. Today, I'm actually going to start moving my paddles using keypresses on the keyboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create some functions for my paddle. Okay? So a function is basically a group of code that is meant to perform a certain task. And that certain task is going to be moving my paddles, in this case. So to do this, I'm basically going to create 4 functions, okay? The 4 functions are going to be moving my first paddle up, moving my first paddle down, moving my second paddle up, and moving my second paddle down. Now, in order to move my first paddle up, the first thing I need to do is to go inside my while loop where the main part of our program takes place. And I'm basically going to define my function, okay? So to do this, I'm just going to say def, and then I'm going to give my function a name. So I'm going to call it paddle1 up, okay? And I'm just going to add some parentheses, open and close parentheses, okay? And a colon. So this is how functions are defined or created, basically. So now I'm going to write the actual code for my function. So I'm just going to create a new line, and as you can see, Python automatically inserted a tab for me. And this is very important because whatever code you want your function to run has to have a tab inserted at the start, okay? So now that I'm inside my function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say paddle1 dot set y, then inside parentheses I'm going to say paddle1 dot y coordinates. So I'm going to explain for a second what I'm doing here. Plus dot y coordinate plus 20, okay? So what this does is it sets the y coordinate of paddle1 to its current y coordinate plus 20 pixels. So if I just run my program, you know how when I start my game, my paddle is at y coordinate 0, right? Well, when I run this function, what's going to happen is that paddle1 will move up by 20 pixels. So it will go from having a y coordinate of 0 to a y coordinate of 20, okay? And when I run my function over and over again, it's going to go 40, 60, 80, 100, and so on. So the y coordinate is going to increase by 20 pixels every time I run my paddle1 up function, okay? But the problem here is that when I ran my program, like you saw, the function was not actually executed. So the paddle did not actually move up by 20 pixels. And the reason for this is because here I'm only defining my function and writing some code for it. And I'm not actually using my function, or I'm not calling it. And so in order to call my function, what I actually need to do is to bind my function to an actual key on my keyboard, so that when I press my keyboard, that function will be executed. So I'm just going to exit out of my function by removing a tab, so I'm back at the same level as all my other blocks of code in my while loop. And I'm basically going to do something called screen.listen, okay? So what this basically does is it basically listens for any key presses. And this is a necessary code if you ever want to do any sort of key binding in Turtle. Now, I'm also going to use another method called onKeyPress, okay? And what this method does is it basically binds a certain action to a key press, okay? So I'm just going to go inside of it and just say paddle1 up, and I'm just going to say W inside quotation marks, okay? And now what's going to happen is that whenever I press the W key, the paddle1 up function is going to be executed. So Python is going to look up to my function here, and it's going to set the y coordinate of my paddle 1 to its current y coordinate plus 20 pixels, okay? So whenever I press the W key, this will be executed. So now when I run my program, you will see that whenever I press the W key, my paddle is going to move up by 20 pixels, which is great. So now that I managed to move my paddle up by pressing the W key, I'm now going to move my paddle down using the S key. And to do this, I'm just going to do the same thing as before, which is creating a function for the paddle's movement. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. Now, instead of having paddle 1 up, I can just change it to paddle 1 down. And now inside of my function, I'm also going to change the plus 20 here to minus 20, so that my paddle actually moves in the downward direction, okay? So now, as you could probably guess, I'm going to write an onKeyPress method for my paddle 1 down function, okay? So I'm just going to copy this here, and now I'm just going to change paddle 1 up here to paddle 1 down, simply. And I'm also going to change the W here to an S. So now when I run my program, you'll see that whenever I press the S key, my paddle moves down by 20 pixels. And you can see that I can move it in whichever direction I want, which is great. So now that I managed to implement the moving functionality for my first paddle, I'm now going to implement one for my second paddle. And to do this, I'm simply going to copy the two functions here. And now, instead of having paddle 1 up here, I'm going to change it to paddle 2 up. And here, instead of setting the Y position of paddle 1, I'm going to set the position of paddle 2. And I'm also going to change paddle 1.y coordinate here to paddle 2.y coordinate, okay? So I basically just copied my previous block of code and just made some minor changes to it. So now I did my changes for this third function, I'm also going to make those changes for my last function, okay? So instead of paddle 1 down, I'm going to say paddle 2 down, and instead of paddle 1.setY, I'm going to say paddle 2.setY, and lastly, instead of paddle 1.y core, I'm going to say paddle 2.y core, okay? And now I'm going to write two more onKeyPress methods. So I'm just going to copy these two lines here, and here instead of having paddle 1 up, I could just change it to paddle 2 up, and here instead of having paddle 1 down, I could instead say paddle 2 down. Now, since I set W and S to be the keybinds for my first paddle, I need to set different keybinds for my second paddle. And the keybinds that make the most sense are the arrow keys, or the up and down keys, since these are what's commonly used in most two-player video games. So now I can just come here, and the name for the up arrow key in Turtle is simply up with a capital P, with a capital U, sorry. And the name for the down arrow key is simply down with a capital D, okay? And it's very important that you get the name exactly right, or else it will not work, okay? Because here, for example, if I set like up with a small U, it would not work, okay? So here, instead of having the W, I can just change that to up with a capital U, and here instead of having the S, I can just change it to down with a capital D. So now that I have bound the movements for my second paddle here to the up and down arrow keys, I'm just going to go ahead and run my program. And you can see here that when I press the up arrow key, my second paddle moves up by 20 pixels, every time, and when I press the down arrow key, my paddle moves down by 20 pixels. So, there you have it.